How did your teacher take things too far when humiliating a student? I was halfway through my second mile when my left ankle folded sideways, snapped, and I went down hard on the track. Coach Lester blew his whistle from across the field. Barbie, get up! We don't have time for drama! I tried to push myself up, but my ankle was already swelling against my shoe. The pain shot up my leg like electricity. Coach, I think something's broken. He jogged over, clipboard in hand. Broken? Let me guess. You need your mommy to kiss it better? I tried to put weight on it and immediately crumpled. The stress was making my shoulder want to jerk, but I forced it still. I'd managed to hide my Tourette's from everyone at school for 3 years. I wasn't about to blow it now. Coach, I can't stand on it. Look, it's already purple. He crouched down and grabbed my ankle without warning. I screamed. Oh, come on. This is exactly why girls don't belong in real athletics. Stop being so dramatic. You're literally grabbing my broken ankle. That's when his face changed. The same disgusted look he got whenever someone couldn't do a pull-up or asked to sit out. You know what your problem is, Barbie? You're weak. You're a soft little girl who runs crying to authority the second things get hard. I was still on the ground. Your daddy obviously wanted a son, so now I have to toughen you up since he gave up. My parents had adopted me when I was 8, and I'd spent every day since wondering if my dad regretted not getting the son he probably wanted. Lester's words felt like confirmation of my worst fears. Get up. Walk to the fence and back. Show these kids that girls can handle real training. The other kids had stopped running and were watching now. Kate Lee looked horrified. The boy I'd been trying to work up the courage to ask to prom was watching me get humiliated by a PE teacher. Liam was filming on his phone until Lester yelled at him to put it away. I tried to stand again. My ankle buckled immediately and I went down harder this time, my head hitting the track. Pathetic! You want to be treated like a helpless little princess? Fine. Crawl to the fence. Maybe crawling will teach you that female athletes need to be twice as tough. What? You heard me, drama queen. Crawl. Show everyone what happens when girls think they can compete without earning it. I needed PE to graduate. My parents had already paid for cap and gown rental. Plus, if I stood up to Lester and caused a scene, my tics would definitely start. The stress and pain were already making my neck want to snap sideways. So I crawled. The track was rough concrete mixed with rubber pellets. It tore up my knees and palms within 10 feet. Behind me, I could hear Lester addressing the class. Take a good look, everyone. This is what happens when girls aren't pushed to be tough. When they're coddled and told they're just as strong as boys. Kate started crying. Coach, this is insane. She needs a doctor. Oh, great. Another bleeding heart girl who thinks feelings matter more than strength. You want to join your girlfriend down there, Lee? Every movement sent lightning through my ankle. I could feel the pieces of my bones grinding together. Halfway to the fence, I threw up. The pain was making me dizzy and nauseous. Lester just laughed. And there it is. Can't even handle a little discomfort without losing her lunch. Your grandmother probably worked in factories during the war, and you can't crawl 50 yards without crying. I wanted to point out that my grandmother had actually been a nurse in Vietnam, but I was too focused on not passing out. You know what the problem is with your generation? Lester continued. Participation trophies and safe spaces. Girls thinking they deserve the same respect without earning it. That's when the fire alarm went off. Through the window, I could see the teacher's pet had pressed the alarm to save me, and everyone had to evacuate immediately. Even Lester couldn't argue with fire safety protocols. The paramedics found me on the track 20 minutes later, still trying to crawl with a compound fracture. The bone had pushed through the skin about 10 feet from the fence. When the EMTs arrived, Lester started screaming that I was faking it for attention, and tried to physically prevent them from treating me. Had a complete psychological break right there on the track, ranting about weak girls destroying competitive sports while literally fighting paramedics. That's when the stress finally broke through. My head started snapping to the side, my shoulder jerking up toward my ear. After 3 years of perfect control, my Tourette's was fully visible to everyone. Suddenly he collapsed on the floor, and the paramedics were asking what I did to him. I couldn't understand what they were asking because my head kept snapping sideways, and my shoulder was jerking up toward my ear over and over. One paramedic was kneeling next to Coach Lester checking his pulse while the other two turned their attention to me. My ankle was screaming, and I could see the white edge of bone sticking through my skin near my shoe. The taller paramedic with the buzz cut started cutting away my shoe with trauma shears, and I threw up again from the pain. He didn't even flinch, just kept working while his partner held my shoulders steady. My tics were firing so fast I couldn't control anything anymore, and everyone was staring. The kids from class were still standing around the track in clusters, and I could see phones out even though teachers were yelling at people to put them away. The paramedic cutting my shoe finally got it off, and my ankle looked wrong, swollen to twice its normal size with purple and black bruising spreading up my calf. The bone fragment was pushing through the skin about 3 inches above my ankle, and there was blood, but not as much as I expected. The shorter paramedic with the dark hair asked me what happened, and I tried to explain about falling during the mile, but my words kept getting interrupted by my head jerking. He looked confused and glanced at his partner who was now wrapping something around my leg to stabilize it. The pain when he touched it made everything go white for a second, and I heard myself screaming. That's when Kate ran over and started talking really fast to the paramedics. She told them Coach Lester made me crawl 50 yards on a broken ankle, and when they tried to help me earlier, he physically blocked them and started screaming. The lead paramedic's whole face changed and went completely still. He pulled out a notebook and started writing while his partner pulled out a radio and called for a second ambulance. Kate was crying while she talked and pointing at the track where you could see the trail I'd crawled with spots of vomit and blood. The paramedic asked her name and wrote it down, then asked if anyone else saw what happened. Kate said the whole PE class saw it, and at least 15 people watched me crawl, while Coach Lester gave a speech about girls being weak. The paramedic with the notebook looked over at Coach Lester, who was still unconscious on the ground, and said something into his radio about possible assault and requiring police response. They got a backboard under me and strapped me down, which made my tics worse because I couldn't move my arms. My shoulder kept trying to jerk up, but the straps held it down, and the feeling of being trapped made me panic. The paramedic kept asking if I was cold because I was shaking so hard, but I couldn't explain that my body just does this now that I'd lost control. They lifted me onto the stretcher and started rolling toward the ambulance, and I could see all my classmates watching. Finn was standing with a group of guys, and he looked away when I made eye contact. Liam still had his phone out filming until a teacher grabbed it. The inside of the ambulance was bright white and smelled like chemicals, and the paramedic started cutting off my PE clothes to check for other injuries. He found the scrapes on my knees and palms from crawling and photographed them with a camera he pulled from a cabinet. Every time the ambulance hit a bump, the pain in my ankle shot up my leg like lightning, and I kept throwing up into a bag they gave me. My tics were still going, and the paramedic finally asked what was wrong with my neck and shoulder. I tried to say it was nothing, but he kept waiting for an answer. The ambulance pulled into the ER bay, and suddenly everything was moving really fast. They wheeled me through automatic doors into a room with bright lights, and immediately 6 people in scrubs surrounded me. Someone was cutting off the rest of my clothes while someone else was starting an IV in my arm. A woman with gray hair kept asking me questions about allergies and medications, but I couldn't focus because my head wouldn't stop jerking. She asked again about my neck, and this time I just said it out loud for the first time to anyone at the school. I told her I have Tourette's syndrome, and her face didn't change at all. She just wrote it down on her clipboard and kept asking other questions. A doctor came in and examined my ankle without touching it much, just looking at the bone sticking through and the swelling. He used words I barely understood like compound fracture and surgical emergency and significant tissue damage. He told the nurses to prep me for surgery within the hour, because the bone broke through skin and there was high infection risk. Someone was asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and I said 10, but honestly it felt like 100. They were hooking me up to monitors that beeped and putting warm blankets on me even though I was sweating. A nurse with red hair leaned down close and asked me how I got injured. I started to say I fell during PE, but then I heard Kate's voice in my head telling the paramedics the truth. I took a breath and the words came out shaky but clear. I explained that my PE teacher made me crawl on a broken ankle as punishment for being dramatic about the injury. The doctor stopped what he was doing and looked at me, then looked at the red-haired nurse, then back at me. His face got really serious and he said they're required to report this and asked if I'm safe going home. Hearing him say that out loud made me realize how bad it sounded when you said it plain. A hospital social worker appeared from somewhere and started asking more questions while they kept prepping me for surgery. My parents showed up right then, and my mom was crying before she even got through the door. My dad's face was red and his hands were in fists, and he looked like he wanted to hit something. They were both asking what happened at the same time and talking over each other. I tried to explain through the fog of whatever pain medication they'd given me that was making everything fuzzy around the edges. My tics were still firing even though I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open. My mom kept touching my face and crying, and my dad was demanding answers from the doctor about surgery and recovery time. The doctor explained they needed to operate immediately, and my parents would have to wait. A nurse made them sign consent forms while another nurse was shaving part of my leg. Someone put a mask over my face and told me to count backward from 10. I got to 7 before everything went black. When I woke up, my leg felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I couldn't move it at all, and when I looked down, there was metal everywhere. Pins and rods were drilled into my leg holding the bones in place, and the whole thing looked like something from a science fiction movie. A surgeon in blue scrubs was standing next to my bed, explaining that the break was too bad for a regular cast. He said I'd have this external fixator hardware for at least 8 weeks, and then need months of physical therapy. My mouth was so dry I could barely talk, and my tics had calmed down some but were still there, my head jerking every few seconds. The surgeon kept talking about bone fragments and surgical pins and infection protocols, but I was focused on the metal cage attached to my leg. This was real and visible, and I couldn't hide it the way I'd hidden my Tourette's for 3 years. My parents showed up about an hour later, and they both looked like they'd been crying. Mom grabbed my hand, and Dad stood at the foot of the bed staring at the metal cage on my leg. They started asking questions all at once about what happened and how I got hurt, and why nobody called them sooner. I told them I fell during PE and hurt my ankle really bad. I explained that Coach said I was being dramatic and that I asked for help, but he wouldn't let anyone call 911. Mom's face got red and Dad's hands made fists again. They asked what Coach did exactly, and I said he told me to walk it off, and when I couldn't, he made me keep going anyway. I left out the crawling part because saying it out loud would make it real, and I was so ashamed that I actually did it. Dad asked if anyone else saw what happened, and I said yeah, the whole class was there. Mom wanted to know why the school didn't call them immediately when I got hurt, and I didn't have an answer for that. A nurse came in to check my vitals and adjust my IV, and my parents stepped back, but kept staring at me like they were trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. After the nurse left, Mom sat down in the chair next to my bed and got really quiet. She said the school called them while I was in surgery and told them Coach Lester collapsed on the track. She said he's in the same hospital somewhere and they don't know what's wrong with him yet. Then she looked right at me and asked if I knew what happened to him. I said no, which was true. I had no idea why he collapsed. But I could see in her face that she didn't totally believe me. She kept looking at me weird like she thought I did something to him somehow. Dad asked if Coach did anything else besides make me walk on a broken ankle, and I said he yelled a lot and called me dramatic. I didn't mention the comments about girls being weak or him grabbing my ankle or any of it, because I just wanted them to stop asking questions. My head was jerking to the side every few seconds from my tics, and I could see them noticing but not saying anything about it. Finally, a different nurse brought them some paperwork about my surgery and care instructions, and they got distracted reading through everything. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but my brain wouldn't shut off. That night after my parents left, I finally grabbed my phone from the table next to my bed. The screen lit up with notification after notification, way more than I'd ever gotten before. I had hundreds of messages and missed calls. Most of them were from people I barely even knew at the school asking what happened and if I was okay. Some were asking if it was true that Coach had a heart attack. A few were asking if I really broke my ankle or if I was faking. I scrolled through all of it feeling sick to my stomach. Then I saw messages from Kate and even one from Lorelai asking if I was all right. Kate had sent like 10 messages over the past few hours, getting more and more worried. I texted her back saying I was okay, just out of surgery, and thanks for speaking up for me. She responded right away even though it was late. She said she was so glad I was okay, and that everyone at the school was talking about what happened. Then she sent another message saying Liam's video got deleted by a teacher before he could post it anywhere, but at least 15 people saw it before it disappeared. She said some kids were saying I must have done something to Coach Lester to make him collapse. Like I have powers or something. She added that it would be funny if it wasn't so awful. I stared at that message for a long time. People thought I hurt him somehow. People thought I had some kind of weird ability that made him have a heart attack or whatever happened. I wanted to text back something clever, but I was too exhausted and my head was pounding. I just sent back a tired emoji and put my phone down. The next morning, a woman in business clothes came into my room and introduced herself as a hospital social worker. She asked if we could talk privately, and my parents stepped out into the hallway looking confused. The social worker pulled a chair close to my bed and explained that the ER doctor who treated me filed a report with the school district. She said he also might have filed one with the police, but she wasn't sure about that part yet. She told me that what happened to me fits the definition of abuse and medical neglect. Those words sounded so serious and official. She kept talking about mandated reporting and duty to protect minors, and I felt panic rising in my chest. I said I just wanted to graduate and forget this whole thing happened. She shook her head and explained it wasn't my choice anymore because I'm a minor and there's clear evidence of harm. She handed me some papers about victim advocates and counseling services. I took them, but I wasn't really looking at them. My hands were shaking and my shoulder was jerking up toward my ear over and over. She noticed my tics but didn't say anything about them. She just told me someone from the district would probably want to talk to me soon, and then she left. My parents came back in asking what that was about, and I had to explain that the hospital reported what Coach did. Dad looked almost relieved, like finally someone was taking it seriously. Mom looked worried about what it all meant. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said her name was Cheyenne Cruz, and she was the school counselor. She asked how I was doing in this really kind, gentle way that made me want to cry. Then she said she wanted to talk to me about something she noticed. She brought up my tics really carefully, asking if I had any documentation for accommodations I might need. I felt my face get hot. I admitted I'd been hiding my Tourette's for 3 years because I didn't want to be treated differently. I expected her to ask why I hid it or make it a big deal, but she didn't. She just explained calmly that I'm legally entitled to something called a 504 plan. She asked if we could meet when I got released from the hospital to talk about what kind of support I need. I said okay, even though I had no idea what a 504 plan was. She said she'd call back in a few days to set up a time and told me to focus on healing. After I hung up, I felt weird, like maybe asking for help wasn't as bad as I thought. That evening, Dad came back to the hospital without Mom. He sat in the chair next to my bed for a really long time without saying anything. I could hear machines beeping and people talking in the hallway, and my own tics making small sounds. Finally, he asked why I didn't tell them I needed help on the track. He asked why I crawled instead of just refusing. I tried to explain about needing PE to graduate and not wanting to cause problems. I said I thought if I just did what Coach said, it would be over faster. But then the real truth started coming out and I was crying. I told him I was afraid that if I made a scene, my tics would start and everyone would see. I said I'd worked so hard to hide them for 3 years, and I didn't want to lose control in front of the whole class. He looked at me confused, like he couldn't understand why that would matter so much. He started to say something, but then stopped and just sat there looking at my leg in its metal cage. The silence stretched between us until I couldn't take it anymore. I started talking before I could stop myself, words tumbling out about how I'd been hiding my Tourette's since we moved here 3 years ago. I told him I wanted to be normal, wanted to be the kid he and Mom hoped for when they adopted me. My shoulder jerked up toward my ear twice while I talked, and I didn't try to stop it. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then a nurse walked in to check my vitals and the moment evaporated. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm and asked how my pain was on a scale of 1 to 10, while Dad just sat there staring at his hands. 3 days later, they discharged me with a wheelchair I didn't know how to use properly, and crutches I couldn't even try yet because of the external fixator. The metal cage around my leg stuck out at weird angles with pins going straight through my skin into the bone. I caught my reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror before we left and barely recognized myself. The girl staring back had a metal apparatus bolted to her leg, and visible ticks she couldn't hide anymore. I was trading one disability I'd successfully hidden for another one that announced itself to everyone who looked at me. The discharge nurse loaded me up with prescriptions for pain medication and infection prevention, and instructions for keeping the pin sites clean. Mom pushed my wheelchair while Dad carried the folder of paperwork, and we made our way to the car in silence. At home, they'd set me up in the downstairs guest room because stairs were impossible with the fixator. Mom had rearranged all the furniture and bought special pillows for elevating my leg, and moved a TV in from somewhere. She kept asking if I needed anything and adjusting things, and I could tell she was trying really hard, but had no idea what to say about anything that happened. She'd made my favorite foods and stocked the mini fridge she'd put in the corner with drinks and snacks. Every time she came in to check on me, she looked like she wanted to have a serious conversation, but then just asked about my pain levels instead. Dad mostly stayed upstairs or in his office, and the few times he came to check on me, he stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he should come in. The school sent homework packets the first week with a letter saying I was excused from PE for medical reasons, and they'd work out alternative credit so I could graduate. There was information about tutoring services if I needed help keeping up with classwork while recovering. But there was no mention of Coach Lester or any investigation or anything about what the social worker said would happen. The letter was signed by the principal, and it felt weird and formal, like they were pretending the crawling and the bone breaking through my skin and Coach fighting the paramedics never happened. I read it 3 times looking for something, anything, that acknowledged what he did to me. Kate texted asking if I got the same generic letter, and when I said yes, she sent back a bunch of angry face emojis. Kate came to visit after school the first week and brought notes from our classes and homework assignments the teachers wanted me to have. She sat on the edge of my bed, carefully avoiding my leg, and told me Coach Lester was still in the hospital. She said rumors were flying about what was wrong with him. Some kids thought he had a heart attack. Others said it was a nervous breakdown. A few were saying I cursed him somehow, or that I had powers that made him collapse. Kate rolled her eyes at that last one, but I could tell some people actually believed it. She said the whole school was talking about what happened on the track and everyone had different versions of the story. I asked Kate what she actually saw, and she took a breath before describing it. She said Coach Lester was screaming at the paramedics about me faking for attention and getting more and more worked up. His face was bright red and he was sweating through his shirt. When the paramedics tried to get past him to reach me, he physically blocked them and started ranting about girls destroying competitive sports. Then he grabbed his chest and just collapsed right there on the track. Kate said it was scary, but also he'd been red-faced and sweating for a while before that, like maybe it was building up. She said one of the paramedics immediately started working on him, while the other 2 focused on me, and then the second ambulance arrived. Kate pulled out her phone and showed me a message from Lorelai saying she was sorry she didn't pull the fire alarm sooner. Kate explained that Lorelai had been watching from inside the building doing track timing, and saw the whole thing through the window. She watched me fall and ask for help and then start crawling. Lorelai knew pulling the fire alarm would get her in serious trouble, but she did it anyway because she could see I needed help, and Coach wasn't going to allow it. Kate said Lorelai felt guilty for not acting faster. Like maybe if she'd pulled it right away, my ankle wouldn't have gotten as bad. I wanted to tell Lorelai she saved me, but I didn't have her number and wasn't sure what to say anyway. My first physical therapy appointment was awful. Just moving my leg a few inches caused shooting pains that made me gasp, and my tics immediately got worse from the stress. My head was snapping to the side every few seconds, and my shoulder kept jerking up. Aurora Peterson, my physical therapist, noticed right away, but didn't make it weird. She just asked casually if I had Tourette's, and when I nodded, she made a note on her clipboard. She said we'd need to work around that and factor it into my treatment plan. She was the first medical person who treated my Tourette's like it was just another piece of information, not some big dramatic thing that needed special attention or explanation. Aurora explained that stress and pain can make tics worse, which I already knew from experience, but nobody had ever actually said out loud to me before. She said we needed to build that into how we approached my physical therapy, so we weren't making things harder than they had to be. She asked if there were positions or movements that helped or made the tics worse. She wanted to know if I needed breaks, or if there were ways to structure our sessions that would be less stressful. It was the first time anyone in the medical system had treated my Tourette's as just another thing to work around, instead of a problem to fix or ignore. She set up a schedule of exercises I could do at home and said we'd start really slow because of how bad the break was. 2 weeks after the incident, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice said his name was Otis Manning, and he was the athletic director at the school. He asked if my parents and I could come in for a meeting to discuss what happened and figure out next steps. Before I could answer, Mom grabbed the phone from my hand. She told him we'd need to call him back and hung up. Then she immediately pulled up her contacts and said she was calling a lawyer first. That surprised me because we'd never needed a lawyer before for anything. Dad came downstairs when he heard Mom on the phone, and they had a quick whispered conversation in the hallway. I heard Dad say something about protecting me, and Mom agreeing we weren't going into any meeting without legal advice. They made calls while I sat in the guest room wondering how a broken ankle had turned into something that needed lawyers and formal meetings with school administrators. Dad spent an hour on the phone with someone named Arjun Kumar, a lawyer his coworker knew who handled civil rights cases. I could hear Dad in the kitchen explaining what happened, his voice getting louder when he described the crawling part. When he came back to the guest room, he said Arjun wanted to talk to all of us together. So Mom set up the phone on speaker. Arjun had this calm voice that made everything sound less scary, even though the words he was saying were serious. He explained that what Coach Lester did potentially violated something called Title IX, which protects students from discrimination based on sex, and also the ADA because I have a disability, and the school knew about my injury but didn't help. He used the phrase duty of care multiple times, saying the school had a legal responsibility to keep me safe and they failed. The consultation lasted almost an hour, and Arjun asked detailed questions about exactly what Coach said and did, whether anyone else witnessed it, if the school had contacted us yet. When Dad mentioned Otis Manning's call, Arjun said he'd come to any school meetings for free because cases like mine were why he became a lawyer. Mom asked how much this would cost, and Arjun said pro bono, which apparently means free, because he believed what happened to me was serious enough that someone needed to advocate for me whether we could pay or not. That made Mom start crying again. 3 days later, we drove to the school for the meeting with Otis Manning. Arjun met us in the parking lot, wearing a suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. He shook my parents' hands and then bent down to my wheelchair level to shake mine, looking me right in the eyes. Inside, we were led to a conference room where Otis Manning sat at the head of a long table with folders spread out in front of him. Otis stood up when we entered and his smile looked forced, like he was trying really hard to seem friendly. He gestured to chairs and said something about how glad he was we could all sit down together and discuss this unfortunate incident. Before my parents could respond, Arjun cut in and said this wasn't an incident, it was abuse and medical neglect. The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Otis's smile disappeared and he said he understood emotions were running high, but we all wanted the same thing, which was to move forward in a way that supported my education. Arjun asked what specifically the district was doing to address what happened, and Otis started talking about how they take all concerns seriously and have protocols in place. He pulled out a paper and slid it across the table, explaining they were prepared to waive my PE requirement completely and guarantee my graduation. My parents leaned forward to look at the paper, and I could see Mom's face soften, like maybe this was the solution we needed. But Arjun didn't touch the paper. He asked what was being done about Coach Lester and whether other students were safe from similar treatment. Otis's jaw tightened and he said Coach Lester was on medical leave, and the district was handling it internally through proper channels. Arjun asked to see documentation of the internal investigation. Otis shifted in his chair and admitted there wasn't a formal investigation yet, because they were waiting for Coach Lester to recover enough to give his statement, which seemed fair since he'd had a medical emergency. Arjun wrote something in a notebook and asked when they planned to interview the students who witnessed the incident. Otis said they were gathering information, his voice getting defensive. I found my voice even though my throat felt tight. I asked if anyone had talked to Kate or the other kids who were there, or to the paramedics who saw Coach Lester try to block them from helping me. Otis looked at me like he'd forgotten I was in the room. He said they were in the early stages of gathering information, which I understood meant no, they hadn't talked to anyone. Arjun closed his notebook and said we'd be filing a formal Title IX complaint with the Office of Civil Rights and an ADA complaint regarding the failure to accommodate my disability. He was also sending a preservation letter that day, requiring the district to save all documents, videos, and communications related to the incident. Otis's face went pale and he started talking fast about how we should really consider the settlement offer, that involving district legal counsel would just make everything more complicated and drawn out. Arjun stood up and thanked Otis for his time, then held the door for my wheelchair. In the parking lot afterward, Arjun leaned against his car and explained that schools often try to protect themselves and their employees rather than students, which is why having an advocate matters. He asked if I was willing to go through a formal process that might take months and involve interviews and paperwork, and possibly even testimony. I felt exhausted just thinking about it. My ankle was throbbing from sitting in the wheelchair for an hour, and my tics had been firing the whole meeting, my head jerking sideways every few minutes while Otis tried not to stare. Part of me wanted to just take the PE waiver and hide in my house until graduation, pretend none of this ever happened. But I kept thinking about what Kate said, that other people saw everything. What if Coach Lester did this to someone else because the school covered it up? What if there was another girl who fell and got hurt and he made her crawl too? That night I couldn't sleep because my brain wouldn't shut off. I kept replaying the meeting and Otis's face when Arjun mentioned the complaints, how quickly he'd gone from friendly to defensive. Around midnight, I wheeled out to the living room where my parents were watching TV with the sound low. I told them I wanted to file the complaints because what happened to me was wrong and the school was trying to cover it up. Dad's whole face changed and he looked at me the way he used to when I was little and did something that made him proud. Mom squeezed my hand and said they'd support whatever I decided. The next morning, Cheyenne Cruz came to our house for the 504 plan meeting. She arrived with a whole folder of papers and sat down at our kitchen table like this was completely normal. She'd already prepared a draft based on our phone conversation, and she walked us through each accommodation. Movement breaks so I could leave class if my tics got bad. Testing in a separate room so I wouldn't worry about disturbing other students. Permission to leave class without explanation if I needed to. Extra time on assignments if my tics made it hard to write. She'd even included stuff I hadn't thought of, like being excused from presentations if my tics were too severe that day, and having a quiet space available at the school where I could go to calm down. She explained each one carefully and asked if there was anything else I needed. I looked at the papers spread across the table. At all these accommodations I could have had for the past 3 years if I'd just asked. Cheyenne must have seen my face because she said a lot of students hide disabilities because of stigma and fear, and that's exactly why these protections exist, so students don't have to choose between getting help and fitting in. I picked up the papers and started reading through each thing listed. Movement breaks whenever I needed them. Testing alone so my tics wouldn't bother other kids. Permission to leave without explaining why. Extra time if my shoulder was jerking too much to write properly. I made it through the first page before the tears started because I'd spent 3 years forcing my body to stay still in class until I got home and could finally let the tics happen. All that energy wasted on hiding when I could have just told someone and gotten help. My head jerked sideways hard and I didn't try to stop it. Cheyenne pushed a box of tissues across the table and waited while I cried. Mom put her hand on my shoulder. When I could talk again, I asked why nobody told me these things existed, and Cheyenne said lots of kids hide their disabilities because they're scared of being treated different or called out. She said that's the whole point of these protections, so students don't have to choose between getting support and fitting in. Dad signed the papers and Cheyenne said she'd file them with the school that afternoon. 2 days later, Arjun called to say he'd submitted the formal complaints to the district. I was in my wheelchair in the living room doing homework when my phone rang. He explained that he'd filed a Title IX complaint about gender discrimination and an ADA complaint about disability discrimination. Plus, he'd sent letters to the school demanding they keep all records and videos from that day. He said things would probably move fast now that there was official paperwork. Sure enough, the next morning, a woman named Liv called. She said she was the district investigator assigned to my case and needed to schedule a time to interview me. Her voice was professional but not cold. She asked when would work, and I said any time because I was home recovering. We set it up for Friday afternoon. That same day, I got a letter from the principal saying the district takes all allegations seriously, and a full investigation would be conducted. The letter felt fake, like they were just covering themselves. I showed it to my parents, and Dad said it was exactly what Arjun predicted, the school protecting itself instead of actually caring. My phone buzzed with a text from Kate. She said everyone at the school was talking about the complaints. Some kids were saying I was trying to get Coach Lester fired over an accident and that I was being dramatic. But other kids were defending me and saying they'd seen him be mean to students before, especially girls. She said one girl told her that Coach Lester once made fun of her for asking to sit out during her period. Another kid said he'd heard Coach Lester tell girls they were naturally weaker than boys and shouldn't expect to compete. Kate said she was telling everyone what really happened, that he made me crawl with a broken ankle. The next day, I got a message from Finn. I saw his name pop up and my stomach did a weird flip because I'd been planning to ask him to prom before everything happened. The message said he was sorry about what happened to me and hoped I was okay. It was nice but also kind of empty. Like he didn't really know what to say. I read it 3 times trying to find some deeper meaning, but it was just a basic sympathy message. I realized my crush had been based on him being cute and popular, not on actually knowing him as a person. I typed back thanks and left it at that. Friday came and Liv showed up at our house right on time. She had a woman with her carrying recording stuff who she introduced as the court reporter. Liv was maybe 40 with dark hair pulled back and she shook my hand gently, careful of my wheelchair. She asked where would be comfortable to talk, and we set up at the dining room table. The court reporter set up her machine and Liv opened a folder full of papers. She explained that everything I said would be recorded and typed up and I could take breaks whenever I needed. Then she asked me to describe what happened starting from when I fell. I took a breath and started talking. I told her about my ankle snapping and Coach Lester telling me to get up. I described him grabbing my broken ankle and me screaming. I told her about him saying girls don't belong in real sports and that my dad wanted a son. My voice shook when I got to the part about crawling. I had to stop twice because my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't hold my water glass. Liv didn't rush me. She just waited and said, take your time. I told her about the track tearing up my knees and throwing up from the pain. I told her about Coach Lester laughing and talking about participation trophies while I crawled. I told her about the bone pushing through my skin and him blocking the paramedics. When I finished that part, my whole body was shaking and my tics were firing hard. Liv asked about my Tourette's, and if Coach Lester knew. I explained that I'd hidden it for 3 years because I didn't want to be treated different. I said the stress from the injury and his abuse made me lose control, and everyone saw my tics for the first time. I told her I'd been so scared of people knowing that I'd exhausted myself every day suppressing everything. She wrote notes and asked if Coach Lester ever made comments about girls before this. I started remembering all these little things I'd pushed aside. Comments about girls being naturally weaker. Jokes about periods making us emotional. Suggestions that we were too sensitive for competitive sports. He'd say stuff like girls needed to prove themselves twice as hard, or that we were only good at sports that didn't require real strength. I'd heard him tell girls they were being dramatic about injuries, or that they needed to toughen up. Liv's pen moved fast across her paper. She asked if other students heard these things, and I said yes. It happened in front of the whole class regularly. After Liv left, I felt completely drained. That night, Kate texted saying Liv had interviewed her too. Kate said she told them everything, including the speech about participation trophies and girls thinking they deserve respect without earning it. She said Liv's face got really serious during that part, and she wrote a lot of notes. Kate said Liv asked her to describe exactly what she saw and heard, and Kate told her about me crawling and throwing up and Coach Lester laughing. She said other kids were being interviewed too. 3 days later, Arjun called again. He said he'd gotten a copy of the paramedics' report, and it was solid evidence. He read me parts of it over the phone, It said Coach Lester was physically preventing emergency medical people from accessing the patient. It said he became more and more worked up and combative when questioned about my injuries. It documented that he was screaming about me faking for attention, while I had a compound fracture with bone visible through the skin. The report said the paramedics had to call for police backup because Coach Lester was interfering with medical care. Arjun said this was huge because it was official documentation from neutral witnesses who had no reason to lie. He said the paramedics' statements would be hard for the school to dismiss or explain away. I asked what happens next, and he said Liv would finish her investigation and write a report with findings. Then the school board would decide what to do. He said it could take a few more weeks, but the evidence was strong. That night, I sat in my wheelchair looking at all the papers spread across my desk. The 504 plan with all the accommodations I could have had. The complaint documents Arjun filed. The letter from the principal. My phone with messages from Kate and Finn and other kids. Everything felt huge and scary, but also like maybe something was actually going to change. 3 weeks later, I rolled through the front doors of school in my wheelchair, and every head in the hallway turned to stare. My 504 plan was active now, which meant I had accommodations for my Tourette's and my mobility issues. But that didn't make the stares any less intense. My head jerked sideways as I wheeled toward my first class, and I heard someone whisper something I couldn't quite make out. My shoulder jumped up toward my ear, and I forced myself to keep moving forward. The external fixator on my leg stuck out from under my loose pants, metal pins and rods holding my bones together while they healed. I made it to English class, and the teacher helped me position my wheelchair at an accessible desk. My tics were firing constantly from the stress, little movements and sounds that I couldn't control anymore. Some kids looked away quickly when I caught them staring. Others smiled sympathetically. A few just kept staring like I was some kind of exhibit. I got through English and then history, my tics getting worse with each passing minute. By the time second period ended, I was exhausted and my leg was throbbing from sitting upright. I texted my mom that I needed to go home and she came to pick me up. The next day I tried again, and this time I made it to lunch. In the cafeteria, I wheeled up to the table where Kate and some other kids were sitting. A few people moved over to make room for my wheelchair. I was eating my sandwich when I heard voices from the table behind me. One girl said something about me faking my tics for attention, just like Coach Lester said I was faking my injury. My face got hot and my tics spiked, my head snapping to the side twice in quick succession. Before I could say anything, Kate stood up and turned around. She told them that faking doesn't break bones or require surgery, and maybe they should think before they talked about things they didn't understand. Her voice was loud enough that other people at nearby tables looked over. The girls who'd been whispering looked embarrassed and went back to their food. Kate sat back down and squeezed my hand under the table. After lunch, I was wheeling toward my next class when a girl I recognized but didn't know well stopped me in the hallway. She looked nervous and kept glancing around like she didn't want anyone to hear. She said Coach Lester made her run laps last semester when she asked to sit out for cramps. He told her she was being a baby about normal biological functions, and that girls needed to learn to push through discomfort. She asked if she could give a statement to the investigator, and I gave her Liv's contact information that Arjun had shared with me. She thanked me and walked away quickly, and I sat there in the hallway feeling like maybe I wasn't the only one he'd treated badly. By the end of that week, Arjun called to tell me that Liv had contacted him with an update. 3 other students had come forward with complaints about Coach Lester's treatment of female athletes. Nothing as extreme as what happened to me, but all of them described a clear pattern. He dismissed their medical concerns, made comments about girls being naturally weaker, and pushed them to prove themselves in ways he never demanded from male students. Arjun said this was important because it showed a pattern of gender-based harassment, not just one bad incident. Then things got worse. Coach Lester's union rep posted a statement on social media defending him as a dedicated teacher being attacked by oversensitive students who couldn't handle real athletic training. The statement said that modern students expected participation trophies and safe spaces instead of being pushed to excel. It suggested that complaints against tough coaches were part of a larger cultural problem where feelings mattered more than performance. I made the mistake of reading the comments section. Hundreds of people were arguing about whether coaches should be allowed to push students. Some people said I was trying to ruin a good teacher's career because I couldn't handle being challenged. Others defended me and pointed out that making an injured student crawl wasn't tough coaching. It was abuse. People who'd never met me were debating whether I was a victim or a liar. That night, Arjun called again and told me to stay completely off social media. He said anything I posted could be used against me in the investigation or any future legal proceedings. I understood why, but it was hard watching people debate what happened to me like it was some kind of theoretical discussion. They were arguing about tough coaching and student sensitivity while I was living with the physical and emotional consequences every single day. My physical therapy appointments continued twice a week. Aurora had me doing exercises to maintain range of motion and prevent my muscles from getting too weak while the external fixator was still attached. She said I was doing well, but her version of well meant I could use crutches for short distances without my leg collapsing. She told me the external fixator might come off in 6 more weeks if the bone was healing properly. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said I should prepare myself for the possibility that I might never run competitively again. The fracture was severe, and even with perfect healing, my ankle might not have the same strength and flexibility it had before. That hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't planning to run in college or anything, but running had been part of who I was. I'd been on the track team since freshman year. Now I was mourning the loss of my athletic self while also trying to accept that my disability was visible to everyone. It felt like everything I used to be was stripped away piece by piece. During one of my sessions with Cheyenne to review my 504 accommodations, she suggested I might benefit from talking to a therapist who specialized in trauma and chronic illness. I was resistant at first because therapy felt like admitting I couldn't handle what happened. But my parents both encouraged me to try at least a few sessions, and eventually I agreed. The therapist's office was small and comfortable with soft lighting and plants on the windowsill. She asked me to tell her what happened, and I went through the whole story again. When I finished, she said what happened on the track was traumatic, and my brain was trying to process it while also dealing with the physical injury and the sudden exposure of my Tourette's. She explained that it was normal to feel like my identity was shifting, and that grief over losing abilities was real even if other people didn't understand it. She said trauma wasn't just about the event itself, but about how it changed the way I saw myself in the world. For the first time since the incident, someone was acknowledging that this was hard in multiple ways at once, and that made me feel less alone. 6 weeks after starting therapy, Arjun called to tell me Liv Esposito had finished her investigation. He said she found that Coach Lester violated district policies on student safety, gender discrimination, and failure to provide reasonable accommodations. Her report recommended termination and mandatory training for all PE staff. I sat on my bed with the phone pressed to my ear and my shoulder jerking up toward my neck. Arjun explained that the school board was scheduling a hearing on the findings, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak during the public comment period. My stomach dropped because the idea of talking in front of a room full of people with my tics firing was terrifying. But I was also angry that the school had tried to sweep everything under the rug, and if I didn't speak up, they might find a way to protect Coach Lester anyway. I told Arjun yes, I wanted to speak. He said we'd prepare together and he'd make sure I was ready. The next week, Arjun came to my house with a legal pad and helped me write a statement that was factual and calm. He said the board needed to hear what happened and what needed to change, not an emotional rant that they could dismiss. We worked through several drafts, focusing on specific details like the fall, the crawl, the bone breaking through my skin, and Coach Lester blocking the paramedics. Arjun had me practice reading it aloud while my tics happened. My head would jerk sideways in the middle of a sentence and he'd just wait for me to continue. He said the point was to stop trying to suppress my tics during the actual meeting, to let them happen naturally so I wasn't exhausting myself trying to maintain control. We practiced until I could get through the whole statement without stopping, even when my shoulder jumped or my neck snapped to the side. Arjun said I was ready and he'd be sitting right there in the audience if I needed support. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about standing up in front of everyone with my Tourette's fully visible, with people staring and judging. Around midnight, my dad knocked on my door and asked if he could come in. He sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and we were quiet for a long time. Finally, he said he needed to tell me something he should have said weeks ago. He told me he never wanted a son instead of me. He said when they adopted me at 8 years old, he and Mom were just hoping to give me a stable home and help me heal from everything I'd been through before. He admitted he didn't know how to help when I was struggling with my Tourette's diagnosis, so he stayed quiet and hoped I'd come to him if I needed support. He said his silence made me think he was disappointed in me, and that was his biggest failure as a parent. I started crying and my tics got worse, my head jerking hard to the left. Dad put his hand on my shoulder and said he was proud of me for speaking up about what Coach Lester did, for not staying quiet like he had. He said I was braver than he'd ever been, and he was sorry it took him so long to tell me. We talked until almost 2 a.m. about my adoption, and his fears about being a good parent, and how we both needed to be more honest with each other. When he finally left my room, I still couldn't sleep, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The school board meeting room was packed when we arrived. Teachers lined the walls, students filled the back rows, parents sat in the middle section, and I even saw a reporter with a camera near the door. My mom wheeled me down the center aisle, and I spotted Kate and Lorelai sitting together in the front row. Lorelai gave me a small wave, and Kate smiled at me with tears already in her eyes. Finn was there too, sitting with some other kids from the school, which surprised me because we'd barely talked since the incident. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, shuffling papers and talking quietly to each other. Coach Lester wasn't there, but his union rep sat in the front row with a lawyer in a dark suit. Several teachers got up during public comment to speak in support of Coach Lester. They described him as tough but fair, a dedicated educator who pushed students to be their best. One teacher said he'd been coaching for 20 years, and sometimes old-school methods seemed harsh to modern sensibilities, but they got results. My stomach turned because they were erasing what he did to me, making it sound like I just couldn't handle real coaching. The union rep spoke and said Coach Lester was persecuted for doing his job, that students today were too sensitive and couldn't handle discipline without claiming abuse. He said the district was throwing away a good teacher's career to appease an overly emotional student. When it was my turn to speak, Arjun helped me wheel up to the microphone at the front of the room. My tics were going wild, my head jerking to the side every few seconds, and my shoulder jumping up toward my ear. I started reading my statement and my voice shook, but I pushed through. I described falling on the track and asking Coach Lester for help. I described him grabbing my broken ankle and telling me to walk it off. I described crawling 50 yards on the track while he lectured the class about girls being weak and dramatic. I described throwing up from the pain and him laughing. I described the bone pushing through my skin and Coach Lester blocking the paramedics from treating me. My tics kept firing, but I didn't try to stop them. I explained that I'd hidden my Tourette's for 3 years because I was afraid of being treated differently. I said Coach Lester's abuse proved that fear was right, that asking for help or showing weakness would be used against me. I told the board that if they didn't hold him accountable, they were telling every girl athlete in the district that their safety didn't matter, that they had to be twice as tough as boys just to be treated with basic respect. I said the investigation found violations and recommended termination, and anything less than that would be the district choosing to protect an abuser instead of students. When I finished, Kate stood up to speak next. She described watching me crawl and throw up while Coach Lester gave his speech about participation trophies and girls thinking they deserve respect without earning it. She said she tried to protest, and he threatened to make her join me on the ground. She said she'd never forget the sound of my screaming when he grabbed my broken ankle, or the way he blocked the paramedics from helping me. Then Lorelai spoke and explained that she'd been inside timing lapse when she saw everything through the window. She said she pulled the fire alarm because she could see I needed help, and Coach Lester wasn't allowing it. She said she broke the rules because following them would have meant watching a student suffer, and she'd make the same choice again. The last person to speak was a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as Ingrid Rollins and said she'd graduated from our school 5 years ago. She described similar treatment from Coach Lester when she was on the track team. She said he made her run sprints when she told him she was having an asthma attack, told her she was faking to get out of practice. She said he regularly made comments about female athletes being naturally inferior and needing to prove themselves. She said she never reported it because she thought that was just how coaching worked, that being tough meant accepting abuse. She said seeing what happened to me made her realize it wasn't normal coaching. It was abuse, and she wished she'd spoken up years ago so maybe he would have been stopped before he broke my bones. I told them I didn't do anything, that I'd been on the ground with a broken ankle the whole time while he was yelling at the paramedics. One of them stayed with Coach while the other two focused on getting me stabilized and loaded into an ambulance. My head kept jerking to the side and my shoulder was jumping up toward my ear, and everyone could see what I'd been hiding for 3 years. At the hospital, they took me straight to surgery because the bone had pushed through my skin and there was infection risk. When I woke up, I had a metal external fixator drilled into my leg, pins and rods holding everything together. The social worker came the next day and explained that the ER doctor had filed reports with the school district and possibly the police because what happened fit the definition of abuse and medical neglect. I just wanted to graduate and forget this ever happened, but she said it wasn't my choice anymore since there was clear evidence of harm. The school sent homework packets and a letter saying I was excused from PE for medical reasons, but there was no mention of any investigation into what Coach did. My parents hired Arjun Kumar, a civil rights attorney who explained that what happened potentially violated Title IX and basic duty of care. When we met with the athletic director, he kept calling it an unfortunate incident and offered to waive my PE requirement if we didn't pursue formal complaints. Arjun asked what was being done about Coach and whether other students were safe, and the athletic director admitted they hadn't even started an investigation yet. We filed formal complaints and suddenly everything moved fast. The district assigned an investigator who interviewed me, Kate, the paramedics, and eventually 3 other students who came forward with their own stories about Coach's treatment of female athletes. 6 weeks later, the investigator completed her report and found that Coach violated district policies on student safety, gender discrimination, and failure to provide reasonable accommodations. She recommended termination and mandatory training for all PE staff. The school board scheduled a hearing, and Arjun asked if I wanted to speak during public comment. I was terrified but also angry that this almost got swept under the rug, so I said yes. The night before the hearing, my dad finally told me he never wanted a son instead of me, that he just didn't know how to help when I was struggling, and hearing that felt like something breaking loose in my chest. The board meeting room was packed with teachers, students, parents, and local media. Coach wasn't there, but his union rep was, along with several teachers who spoke about him being tough but fair, which made my stomach turn. When my turn came, I wheeled up to the microphone with my tics firing constantly, my head jerking and shoulder jumping, and I read my statement about falling and asking for help and being forced to crawl while he lectured about girls being weak. I explained that I'd hidden my Tourette's for 3 years because I was afraid of being treated differently, and his abuse proved that fear was right. Kate spoke next and described watching me throw up from pain, while Coach laughed, and Lorelai explained that she pulled the fire alarm because she could see through the window that I needed help. Then Ingrid Rollins stood up, a woman who graduated 5 years ago, and she described similar treatment from Coach when she was a student athlete, saying she never reported it because she thought it was just how coaching worked. The board went into closed session to deliberate, and we waited in the hallway for 2 hours. Arjun kept saying the length of deliberation didn't mean anything, but I was convinced they were going to side with Coach. When they finally came back, Carson Gilmore read a statement saying they'd voted to accept the investigators' findings and place Coach on administrative leave pending termination proceedings, and they were implementing new policies for student safety and mandatory reporting of injuries. It wasn't everything I wanted because termination proceedings could take months and he might appeal, but it was more than I expected. Arjun said this was a big win, and the public record of the findings would follow Coach even if he tried to work at another school. The next day, some kids congratulated me in the hallways, and others avoided eye contact completely. A few boys from the football team muttered about me getting a good coach fired, but Kate loudly pointed out that good coaches don't break students' bones and force injured kids to crawl. My 504 plan was working well and teachers were respectful about my accommodations. I took tests in a quiet room where my tics didn't disturb anyone, and I could leave class when I needed to without having to explain myself. 8 weeks after surgery, the external fixator came off and I got a walking boot instead, which felt like freedom even though I was still using crutches for longer distances. Aurora said I was healing well, but I'd need physical therapy for at least 4 more months, and she gently prepared me that I might never run competitively again. Prom was coming up and I decided to go with Kate and a group of friends, rather than waiting for someone to ask me. I was nervous about being in a crowded space with my tics and my walking boot, but I was tired of hiding and missing out on things because I was afraid of what people might think. At prom, some people stared at my boot and my tics, but my friends created a buffer around me and we had fun dancing in ways that worked with my limited mobility. Finn came over during a slow song to say hi and apologize for not being more supportive earlier, which I appreciated even though I was completely over my crush on him. During another slow song, the music suddenly got really loud, and the lights started strobing, which triggered something in my brain. My tics spiked dramatically and I felt like I couldn't breathe, my head jerking so hard my neck hurt and my shoulder jumping uncontrollably. Kate noticed immediately and got me outside to a quiet space away from the noise and lights. She sat with me on a bench while I calmed down, not trying to fix anything or make it stop, just being present while my body did what it needed to do. She said she was proud of me for coming tonight, and that leaving when I needed to wasn't failure. It was taking care of myself, and I realized she was right. 2 weeks before graduation, Arjun called to tell me Coach Lester withdrew his appeal, and the termination was final. He explained the union probably looked at the paramedic documentation and the 3 other student complaints, and told him the case was unwinnable, so backing out now was his best option to avoid more public testimony. I felt relieved, but also weirdly empty, like I'd been bracing for a fight that never came. The district called the next day with a settlement offer for my medical bills and pain and suffering, and Arjun spent an hour on the phone negotiating the terms while I sat on my bed listening to my shoulder jerk every few seconds. He got them to agree to no non-disclosure agreement, which meant I could talk about what happened and they had to implement all the new safety policies we'd proposed. The money wasn't huge, but it covered everything the insurance didn't pay, plus my therapy costs. And Arjun said that was fair, given we avoided years of litigation. I talked to my parents that night about whether to accept it. Mom wanted to push for more, but Dad pointed out that the policy changes would help other students, and that mattered more than punishing the district. I agreed because honestly I was exhausted from fighting and I wanted to focus on graduating and moving forward. My parents put the remaining settlement money in an account for college, which felt like turning something bad into something useful. Finals week hit hard because I was still dealing with constant pain in my ankle and the fatigue from my tics firing all day, but my 504 accommodations made it manageable. I took tests in the quiet room where I could stand up and pace when my leg hurt, and all my teachers gave me extensions when I needed them. Kate studied with me most nights and helped me stay focused when the pain made it hard to concentrate. By the last exam, I knew I was going to graduate on time, which had felt impossible 2 months ago when I was in a wheelchair wondering if I'd ever walk normally again. The school announced the new PE policies during morning announcements the Friday before graduation. They called it the Student Athlete Safety Initiative and listed all the requirements including mandatory first aid certification for coaches, immediate medical evaluation for any injury, and specific protocols for students with disabilities. They didn't mention my name, which I actually preferred because I wanted the policies to matter on their own, not just as a response to one incident. Some kids clapped when the announcement finished, and I saw a few teachers nodding like they approved. Ingrid Rollins messaged me that weekend asking if I wanted to get coffee. We met at a place near campus, and she told me about her experience with Coach Lester 5 years ago, how he made her run until she threw up and told her she was weak for complaining. She said seeing me speak up at the board meeting helped her process what happened to her, made her realize it wasn't normal coaching, it was abuse. She'd started working with the district to review past complaints that had been dismissed or ignored, trying to find patterns of behavior that should have raised red flags years ago. Talking to her felt important because it proved this wasn't just about me, it was about a system that failed multiple students. My physical therapy appointment that week brought news I'd been expecting but dreading. Aurora checked my range of motion and my strength and said I could try light jogging in another month, but competitive running probably wasn't realistic given how badly my ankle had been damaged. The bones healed, but the soft tissue trauma and the way the fracture affected my gait meant I'd never have the same speed or endurance. I felt sad hearing it said out loud, but not devastated like I would have been before all this happened. I was learning that my worth wasn't tied to my athletic performance, that I could be valuable and strong in other ways. Aurora smiled when I told her that and said I'd come a long way from the scared kid she met in the hospital. I spent Sunday afternoon writing a post on my private social media about living with Tourette's and what happened with Coach Lester. My hands shook while I typed because being public about my disability still felt scary, but I was tired of hiding and I wanted other students with Tourette's to know they weren't alone. I explained how I'd suppressed my tics for 3 years, how the stress of the injury made me lose control, how I was learning to accept my body instead of fighting it constantly. I hit post before I could change my mind, and then closed my laptop because I couldn't handle watching the responses come in. When I checked later that night, most comments were supportive, people saying they had similar experiences or thanking me for being open. A few were weird or judgmental, but Kate helped me delete those and reminded me I didn't owe anyone access to my story. Graduation day arrived warm and sunny. I got ready slowly because my ankle was sore from all the walking I'd been doing lately, and my tics were active but manageable. I pulled on my cap and gown over my dress, grabbed my single crutch, and met my parents in the living room. Mom started crying immediately, and Dad hugged me carefully so he wouldn't knock me off balance. We drove to the school, and I lined up with my class in alphabetical order. Kate was a few rows ahead and turned around to wave at me. I could see Lorelai near the front, and even Finn was there looking proud of himself for making it on time. When they called my name, my parents stood up in the audience crying those proud parent tears that make you embarrassed and happy at the same time. I saw Kate and Lorelai cheering, and Finn was clapping too, and Cheyenne was in the teacher section smiling at me. I walked across the stage with my crutch, and my head jerked sideways right as I reached for my diploma. But I didn't care anymore who saw. The principal handed me the folder, and I turned to face the audience. And it felt like victory because 3 months ago I was crawling on a track with a broken ankle thinking my life was over. I wasn't the same person who fell that day. The girl who hid her disability and believed her worth depended on being normal. I was someone different now. Someone who spoke up and fought back and learned that asking for help was strength. And I was starting to think that was okay. The weekend after graduation, I went to 3 different parties, and the same question kept coming up. People asked what I was doing next year, and I explained I was taking a gap semester to finish physical therapy before starting college in January. Some people nodded like they understood, but I could see them thinking I was giving up or being weak. A few people said things like, "Why not just push through, or you're so close to being normal again?" I smiled and said I was being realistic about my needs, which was true even if it felt hard to say out loud. Kate stood next to me at one party, and when someone made a comment about me taking the easy way out, she jumped in and said, "Recovery takes time and rushing it would be stupid." I was grateful she had my back, but also learning to defend my own choices without needing someone to rescue me. At another party, someone asked what I wanted to study, and I said education policy, because I wanted to work on student safety and disability rights. The person looked confused, like they expected me to say something normal like business or nursing. I explained that what happened to me showed how broken the system was, and how much power advocates could have when they refused to be quiet. They nodded, but I could tell they thought I was being dramatic, or making my whole life about one bad thing that happened. But I knew it was more than that. It was about making sure other students didn't have to crawl on broken bones or hide who they were to feel safe. Kate and I were sitting on her back porch a few days later talking about college, and she mentioned we should room together. I said that sounded good, and she laughed and said she was already used to my tics and my middle-of-the-night ice pack routine, so we would be perfect roommates. It felt good to have someone who knew all my stuff and still wanted to live with me. We started looking at dorm options online and making lists of what we needed to bring. Kate kept making jokes about how she would handle my stuff, and I would handle hers, and we would figure it out together. I realized I was excited about college in a way I never was before because I wasn't going to hide anymore. Cheyenne called me the next week and asked if I could come in for a quick meeting. I drove to the school and met her in her office, and she had this big smile on her face. She told me the district had received 5 new requests for 504 plans from students with Tourette's and other disabilities after seeing me speak at the board meeting. She said my visibility gave other students permission to ask for help instead of suffering in silence like I had. I felt proud but also sad that it took something so awful to make other kids feel safe enough to speak up. Cheyenne said change happens slowly, but every student who asks for accommodations makes it easier for the next one. She thanked me for being brave even when it was hard, and I told her she was the one who helped me understand I deserved support. One morning in early summer, I texted Kate and asked if she wanted to go to the track with me. She said yes immediately and picked me up 20 minutes later. We drove to the school, and I felt my stomach get tight as we walked through the gate. The track looked the same as it always had, just rubber and concrete in an oval. I stood at the starting line where I fell and waited for the panic to hit, but it didn't come. Kate asked if I wanted to try walking a lap, and I said yes, even though my ankle was already sore from the drive over. We started walking slowly, me with my crutch and Kate matching my pace without making it obvious she was slowing down for me. The sun was hot and my shoulder jerked a few times, but I kept going. When we got to the spot where I had crawled, I stopped and took a breath. Kate stopped too and waited without saying anything. I looked at the ground and remembered throwing up from the pain and hearing Coach Lester laugh. Then I looked up at the fence I had been trying to reach and realized I didn't need to get there anymore. I was already past it in every way that mattered. We kept walking and finished the lap together, and it wasn't dramatic or movie-like. It was just choosing to move forward one step at a time. My dad and I started having real conversations after that. We would sit in the living room after dinner and talk about stuff we never talked about before. He told me he didn't know how to handle my Tourette's diagnosis when I was younger, and he was sorry I felt like I had to hide it. He said he thought if he didn't make a big deal out of it, then I wouldn't feel different. But instead, his silence made me think something was wrong with me. I listened and my head jerked sideways, but I didn't try to stop it. He kept talking and said he was learning now what he should have known then, that ignoring something doesn't make it go away, and I deserved parents who saw all of me. A few days later, we were sitting outside, and I finally told him what I had been thinking for years. I said I spent all this time thinking he wanted a different kid, one who wasn't disabled and didn't cause problems. He started crying, which I had only seen him do once before at his mom's funeral. He said he just wanted me to be happy, and he failed to see that his silence made me think he was disappointed in who I was. He told me he never wanted a son instead of me. He just didn't know how to be the dad I needed, and he was sorry it took something this bad to wake him up. I cried too, and we sat there together not trying to fix anything, just being honest for the first time. My mom joined our conversations after that, and the three of us talked about how our family could be more open about hard things. They started learning about Tourette's and asking questions instead of pretending it wasn't there. Mom asked what my tics felt like and if there was anything they could do to help. Dad asked if I wanted to talk about the adoption stuff more because he realized we had never really processed it together. They were trying, and that meant more than getting everything perfect. It felt like finally being seen for who I actually was, instead of who they hoped I would be. I started volunteering with a disability rights organization that worked with schools on accommodation policies. It was part-time and mostly remote, so I could manage it with physical therapy. The work involved reviewing school policies and helping families understand their rights under the ADA and IDEA. I would read through 504 plans and IEP documents and point out where schools were failing to provide proper support. Sometimes I talked to parents whose kids were going through what I went through, and I could tell them it was possible to fight back and win. The organization paired me with a mentor who had been doing this work for 20 years, and she taught me how to navigate the system. It felt good to turn my experience into something that helped others, instead of just carrying it around like a weight. Arjun called a few weeks later and asked if I would speak at a conference about student rights and Title IX cases. My stomach dropped because talking to investigators was one thing, but standing in front of a room full of lawyers and advocates felt huge. He explained it would be a panel discussion with other students who had fought discrimination cases, and my story could help people understand why these protections matter. I said yes, even though I was scared because I was learning that my experience meant something beyond just what happened to me. The conference was in August, and I spent weeks preparing my talking points with Arjun's help, practicing while my tics fired and my shoulder jerked because I knew people would be watching. 3 months after graduation, I got a message on social media from a girl named Maya at a school 2 hours away. She said she heard about my case through the news coverage, and she needed help because her volleyball coach kept making jokes about her anxiety disorder and telling her she was too weak for competitive sports. Reading her message felt like looking in a mirror from a year ago, and I knew exactly what she was going through. I sent her links to the disability rights organization I volunteered with and explained how to file a complaint with her school district. I gave her Arjun's contact information and told her she didn't have to handle this alone. She wrote back saying thank you and that she didn't know reporting was even possible until she saw what I did. That's when I understood what advocacy actually looked like. It wasn't just about my own case anymore, but about using what I learned to help other people fight back. My physical therapy appointments with Aurora were getting less frequent as I got stronger and learned the exercises I needed to do at home. She evaluated my progress and said I was ready to transition to a home program, which meant I wouldn't need weekly appointments anymore. Aurora explained I would always have some limits with my ankle and probably develop arthritis when I got older, but I was functional and building strength every day. She showed me the exercises to keep doing and warned me to listen to my body when it said to rest. I thanked her for treating my Tourette's like it was just another thing to work around instead of making it weird or uncomfortable. She smiled and said, "That's what good healthcare looks like, seeing the whole person instead of just their diagnosis or injury." January came fast, and suddenly I was moving into my college dorm for orientation week. I met with disability services on my first day and filled out paperwork for accommodations without feeling ashamed or like I was asking for special treatment. The coordinator was helpful and professional, and she set up testing accommodations and permission to leave class if my tics got bad. I told her about my Tourette's and my ankle limitations, and she typed everything into the system like it was completely normal. When she asked if I had questions, I realized I didn't, because for the first time I wasn't hiding or pretending to be someone I wasn't. Kate arrived the next day with her parents and 2 huge suitcases, and we started unpacking in our tiny dorm room. She helped me arrange my desk and closet so everything was easy to reach with my mobility issues, and we figured out where to put my ankle brace and heating pad. We hung up a photo from graduation that showed both of us smiling in our caps and gowns, me holding my crutch and my head caught mid-tic in the picture. Kate said it was her favorite photo because it showed us being real instead of trying to look perfect. I agreed, and looking at it on our wall made me feel proud instead of embarrassed about everything that showed in that moment. The disability advocacy group on campus held their first meeting during orientation week, and I went by myself feeling nervous but determined. There were about 15 students there with all different kinds of disabilities, including 3 other people with Tourette's, and several with chronic pain conditions. For the first time, I was in a room where nobody stared at my tics or asked invasive questions about my ankle brace. We went around introducing ourselves and sharing what brought us to the group, and I talked about the track incident and fighting my school district. Other students shared their stories about inaccessible buildings and professors who refused accommodations and feeling invisible on campus. Being in that community made me realize my body's differences weren't something I needed to overcome or fix. They were just part of who I was, and that was okay. My first week of college classes went better than I expected, because I wasn't spending all my energy trying to suppress my tics or hide my pain. When my head jerked during a lecture, I didn't panic about people noticing. I just kept taking notes. When I needed to shift positions because my ankle hurt, I did it without worrying what everyone thought. One professor asked about my accommodations after class, and I explained my Tourette's and mobility issues clearly and calmly. She thanked me for letting her know and said to email her if I ever needed anything adjusted. Walking back to my dorm after that class, I realized how much energy I used to waste on hiding and pretending, and now I could use that energy for actually learning. I started video calling my parents every Sunday night to catch up on the week. Our conversations were different now because we were being honest instead of dancing around hard topics. They told me they joined a support group for parents of kids with disabilities, and they were learning things they wished they knew when I was younger. Mom said the group helped her understand that protecting me by ignoring my Tourette's actually made me feel more alone. Dad said he was working on asking me directly what I needed instead of assuming or avoiding the subject. Hearing them talk about actively trying to be better parents made me feel seen in a way I never had before. They asked about my classes and my advocacy work and how my ankle was doing, and I answered honestly without downplaying anything. The anniversary of the track incident fell on a Tuesday in late September. I sat in my dorm room that evening with my journal and wrote about everything that happened over the past year. I wrote about crawling on broken bones and the surgery and the school board meeting and graduation. I wrote about learning to be open about my Tourette's and starting college and finding my community. I wasn't grateful for the trauma because what Coach Lester did was wrong and it hurt me in ways that would never fully heal. But I was proud of how I handled it. Proud that I spoke up even when I was terrified. Proud that I turned my worst experience into something that could help other people. Writing it all down helped me see how far I had come from that scared girl on the track. Later that night, I sat on my bed thinking about who I used to be and who I was becoming. The girl who hid her Tourette's for 3 years did what she needed to survive in an environment that felt unsafe. The woman I was now, speaking at conferences and helping other students and living openly with my disability, was doing what I needed to thrive. Both versions were me, and neither one was wrong. I survived by hiding, and now I was thriving by being visible, and that progression made sense. Understanding that I didn't have to reject my past self to embrace my current self felt like the final piece of healing clicking into place. A few weeks later, Kate texted asking if I wanted to go to a college track meet with her on Saturday. I almost said no because the thought of watching runners made my chest tight, but then I remembered I was trying to do things that scared me instead of hiding. We sat in the bleachers while college athletes warmed up on the track, stretching and jogging and looking so confident in their bodies. I waited for the ache to hit, the grief over losing my athletic identity, but it never came. I watched them run their races and I felt interested, but not devastated. Kate noticed me smiling and asked what I was thinking. I told her I used to think running was the only thing I was good at, but now I was learning about policy work and advocacy and building community, and those things felt just as important. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of how far I'd come. Walking back to campus, I felt lighter, like I'd passed some test I didn't know I was taking. The next Monday, I opened my email and found a message from the district with the subject line Student Athlete Safety Initiative Completion Report. They'd finished training all coaches and PE staff on the new protocols we'd pushed for after what happened to me. The email included statistics showing that injury reports had gone up by 40%, and accommodation requests had doubled, which meant students were actually using the new system instead of suffering in silence like I did. I forwarded the email to Arjun and my parents with a short note saying the policy changes were working. My mom called that night crying happy tears because she could see that my pain had created something that helped other kids. I saved the email in a folder I was keeping of advocacy wins. Small proof that speaking up mattered. 2 weeks later, Ingrid contacted me asking if I wanted to present with her at a school board meeting in the next county over. They were reviewing their athletic policies and wanted to hear from people who'd experienced coaching abuse. I said yes, even though public speaking still made my tics worse. We met at a coffee shop the day before to prepare our presentation. Ingrid talked about her experience with Coach Lester years ago and how the school were ignored her complaints. I described the crawling and the broken ankle and the policy changes that came after. We practiced answering questions the board might ask about the difference between tough coaching and harmful treatment. At the actual meeting, we sat at a table facing the board members and took turns speaking. Ingrid explained how she normalized abuse because she thought pushing through pain was what athletes did. I talked about how hiding my disability made me vulnerable to someone who saw accommodations as weakness. Several board members took notes during our presentation. One asked what specific policy language we'd recommend, and I pulled out the Student Athlete Safety Initiative framework from my district. After the meeting, 3 board members came up to thank us and said they were going to propose similar changes. Back at the school, my education policy professor returned our midterm papers with comments. She'd given me an A on my analysis of Title IX enforcement in athletic programs. Her note at the top said my writing showed deep understanding of how policy intersects with lived experience, and she suggested I consider law school after graduation. I stayed after class to talk to her about it. She explained that lawyers who understand both policy and personal impact can create real change in systems. I told her I was interested but not decided yet, that I wanted to explore different kinds of advocacy work before committing to 3 more years of school. She said that was smart, that I had time to figure out what path fit me best. Walking out of her office, I felt validated, like my experiences weren't just trauma, but also expertise that mattered. That week at my disability advocacy group meeting, I met someone new who'd just joined. He had chronic pain from a car accident 2 years ago and used a cane on bad days. We started talking after the meeting about accommodations we'd requested and professors who were helpful versus ones who made everything difficult. He understood my frustrations without me having to explain why stairs were hard some days or why I needed to shift positions during long lectures. We exchanged numbers and started getting coffee between classes. By November, we were dating, and it felt easy in a way my high school crush never did. He got why I needed to ice my ankle after walking across campus. I understood why he had to cancel plans sometimes when his pain flared up. Neither of us had to justify our limitations or pretend to be less disabled than we were. We could just exist together without performance or shame. Spring semester started with an email from Disability Services asking if I'd speak at orientation for incoming students with disabilities. They wanted someone to talk about self-advocacy in college and navigating accommodation systems. I agreed and spent a week preparing what to say. The orientation was in a small auditorium with about 30 incoming students and their parents. I stood at the podium with my notes and told them about hiding my Tourette's in high school for 3 years. I described how that hiding almost destroyed me, and how asking for help in college changed everything. I explained that accommodations aren't special treatment. They're tools that level the playing field so we can show what we're actually capable of. I talked about my 504 plan and how professors had been respectful once I was honest about my needs. I said asking for help is strength, not weakness, even though our culture tries to convince us otherwise. My tics were active the whole time I spoke, but I didn't apologize for them or try to suppress them. After the presentation, several students came up to talk to me. One girl with anxiety told me she'd been denied accommodations at her high school and was scared to ask again. A guy with ADHD said he'd never had formal accommodations and didn't know what to request. Another student with a chronic illness described being punished for missing class and not knowing how to advocate for medical absences. I gave them my email and phone number and said to contact me anytime they needed support. Over the next few weeks, we started meeting informally as a peer support group. We'd gather in the student union to talk about accommodation letters and difficult professors and strategies for managing disabilities in college. It felt good to build community with people who understood the daily navigation of being disabled in spaces designed for able-bodied people. One afternoon, Kate and I were studying in our dorm when she closed her laptop and said she needed to tell me something. She'd decided to change her major from business to special education. She explained that watching what I went through with Coach Lester made her realize she wanted to be the kind of teacher who protects students instead of harming them. She wanted to work with kids who had disabilities and make sure they never felt like they had to hide or that their needs were burdens. I started crying because my worst experience had inspired my best friend to dedicate her career to helping other kids. She hugged me and said I'd changed her whole perspective on what teaching could be. I told her she was going to be an amazing teacher because she actually cared about students as whole people, not just test scores or compliance. Finals week arrived and I was exhausted but prepared. My grades came back and I'd gotten mostly A's with 1 B in statistics. I had strong relationships with my roommate and my boyfriend and my advocacy group friends. I had a sense of purpose I didn't have before, a clear direction for my life that went beyond just surviving. My ankle still hurt on rainy days and after long walks across campus. My tics were still visible and sometimes embarrassing when they happened during quiet moments in the library. But I wasn't ashamed anymore. I didn't spend energy trying to appear normal or hiding parts of myself. I was just living as my full self, disability and all, and that felt like the biggest victory. That summer, I started an internship at Arjun's law firm doing research on disability rights cases and Title IX complaints. My first week, I read through case files about students who'd been denied accommodations or punished for their disabilities. I compiled research on legal precedents and wrote summaries of relevant court decisions. Arjun taught me how to analyze policy language and identify where discrimination was happening even when it wasn't obvious. I learned about the legal frameworks that were supposed to protect students like me, and how often those protections failed because schools prioritized liability over student safety. The work was hard and sometimes triggering when I read cases similar to mine, but it also felt meaningful. I was learning how the legal system could be a tool for change when used by people who actually cared about justice, instead of just winning cases. That August, the district invited me to speak at their mandatory staff training on recognizing abuse and supporting students with disabilities. I drove to my old high school on a Wednesday morning and my stomach twisted when I pulled into the parking lot. The building looked exactly the same, but I wasn't the same person who used to hide in bathroom stalls trying to suppress my tics before class. I walked through the main entrance without crutches for the first time since the injury, and my ankle ached but held my weight. The principal met me in the lobby and thanked me for coming, and I could tell she was nervous about what I might say. They set me up in the auditorium where I'd sat through countless assemblies, and now I was standing at the podium looking out at 200 teachers and staff members. I talked for 20 minutes about what happened on the track, and how the system failed me and what needed to change. My head jerked to the side twice during my presentation, and I didn't try to hide it or apologize. I just kept talking about accommodation policies and mandatory injury protocols, and the difference between tough coaching and abuse. When I finished, several teachers came up to thank me, and one admitted she'd heard rumors about me, but never knew the full story. The new PE department head introduced herself and explained they'd completely overhauled their safety procedures. She walked me through the new protocols where any visible injury triggers immediate medical evaluation, and students can request accommodations without needing to prove their disability first. She showed me the updated training materials that used my case as an example of what happens when coaches prioritize toughness over student safety. Another new PE teacher mentioned that every staff member now carries emergency contact information, and first aid certification is required annually. She said my case changed how the entire district approaches student injuries, and I felt something shift in my chest, knowing that my pain had created real systemic change. I asked to visit the new coach during her office hours, and she welcomed me into her office that still smelled like old gym equipment and sweat. She was young and enthusiastic and immediately asked what accommodations I needed for the meeting. I explained about my Tourette's, and she just nodded and said she'd had several students with tics in her previous school, and asked if I needed anything specific like a quieter space or movement breaks. She treated my disability as simple logistical information instead of a character flaw or something to overcome. We talked about her approach to coaching, and she emphasized that pushing students meant challenging them appropriately while respecting their physical and mental limits. I left her office wishing I'd had a teacher like her instead of someone who saw my body as something to break down and rebuild. My parents had driven separately to attend the training, and afterward we got in the car together. Dad asked if I wanted to stop at the track on our way out, and I looked at the fence line where I'd crawled with a compound fracture. I realized I didn't need to stand there or reclaim that space because it didn't hold power over me anymore. I'd built a life beyond that track, and that moment didn't define me even though it changed everything. We drove past without stopping, and I felt lighter than I had in months. Back at college for sophomore year, I threw myself into disability advocacy work with new focus. The campus group elected me co-chair, and suddenly I was running meetings and coordinating events and training student leaders. We launched a campaign to improve campus accessibility by documenting every building with broken elevators or missing ramps. We created a database of professors who were accommodation-friendly versus those who made students fight for basic rights. We organized training sessions teaching students how to advocate for themselves with difficult professors and navigate the accommodation request process. I was taking an education policy class that semester, and I decided to write my final paper on protecting student-athletes from abusive coaching. I spent weeks researching Title IX requirements and state athletic association policies and best practices from districts that actually prioritize student safety. I interviewed Aurora about the physical therapy perspective and Arjun about the legal frameworks. I analyzed my own case as a primary source and identified specific policy failures that enabled the abuse to continue. My professor gave me an A and wrote extensive comments about the research quality and practical applications. She asked if I'd consider submitting it to an education policy journal, and I thought she was joking until she sent me the submission guidelines. I revised the paper over winter break and submitted it to 3 journals, figuring I'd get rejected from all of them. 2 months later, I got an acceptance email, and suddenly I was a college sophomore with a published article on student safety in athletics. Arjun sent me a congratulatory text saying this was just the beginning of my advocacy career, and I should start thinking about law school. The publication led to an invitation to speak at a state education conference about student rights and disability accommodations. I stood at the podium in front of 300 educators and policymakers, with my tics firing every few seconds. My shoulder jerked up toward my ear and my head snapped sideways, and I didn't apologize or explain. I just told my story about hiding my Tourette's for 3 years and crawling on a broken ankle and how the system failed me at every level until I learned to advocate for myself. I talked about the policy changes my district implemented and the research showing that student safety improves when schools prioritize accommodation over compliance. I realized standing there with my disability visible and my story clear that I'd transformed my trauma into my life's work. Kate and I were still roommates and best friends, and she was absolutely thriving in her education program. She'd found her calling working with students who had disabilities and learning differences. We studied together at our tiny dorm room desk and supported each other through hard classes and harder emotional days. Sometimes we laughed about how a fire alarm on a track had changed both our lives and set us on paths we never would have found otherwise. She was learning how to be the kind of teacher who protects students, and I was learning how to change the systems that harm them. My relationship with my parents continued to deepen as we all grew and learned together. They drove 4 hours to attend my conference presentation and sat in the front row taking notes. Afterward, Mom hugged me and said she was amazed by who I'd become. I told her I couldn't have done any of it without their support, even when it was imperfect, and even when we were all still figuring things out. Dad said he was proud of me for taking the worst thing that ever happened and turning it into something that would help thousands of other students. We went to dinner after the conference and talked about my future plans, and they didn't try to fix anything or make suggestions. They just listened and believed in me, and that felt like the biggest gift they could give. I still do my physical therapy exercises 3 times a week, even though the external fixator came off years ago. My ankle aches when it rains, and sometimes I wake up with sharp pains that remind me of crawling on that track. I've learned to ice it before bed and stretch it every morning and accept that some days I'll limp more than others. Aurora told me this is my new normal, and fighting it just makes everything harder. I keep a heating pad at my desk and take breaks to elevate my leg during long work sessions. Some advocacy friends ask why I don't just take pain medication all the time, but I don't want to spend my life foggy when I have work to do. I've learned that acknowledging my limitations isn't giving up. It's being realistic so I can sustain this work long term, instead of burning out trying to be someone I'm not anymore. On the 2-year anniversary of the incident, I sit down and write a blog post about survival and recovery. I talk about how healing isn't linear, how some days I'm fine and other days I'm back on that track in my mind. I write about learning to live with chronic pain and visible tics, and how trauma changes you in ways that don't just disappear because time passes. I post it publicly on my personal blog, expecting maybe 50 people to read it. Within 3 days, it has 10,000 shares. My inbox fills with hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of surviving abuse, finding purpose after trauma, learning to live with disabilities. A teacher writes that she's changing how she handles student injuries. A coach writes that he's rethinking his entire approach to athletic training. A girl with Tourette's writes that seeing me speak openly gave her courage to stop hiding. The response is overwhelming, and I have to turn off notifications because I can't keep up. A documentary filmmaker contacts me through my blog and asks if I'd be willing to participate in a project about student athletes and systemic abuse. I'm immediately suspicious because I've seen too many exploitation documentaries that use people's trauma for entertainment. I schedule a call with the filmmaker and ask hard questions about the project's purpose and how survivors will be portrayed. She explains she's focusing on policy failures and institutional accountability, not just individual horror stories. I talk with Arjun about the legal implications, and with my parents about the emotional cost of reliving everything publicly. Dad worries it will be too hard on me, but I remind him that visibility creates accountability. If my story can pressure other schools to change their policies, then the documentary serves a purpose beyond my personal healing. I agree to participate with clear boundaries about what I will and won't discuss on camera. The documentary crew films me at college walking between classes with my tics visible and my limp obvious. They film me at physical therapy doing exercises and talking with Aurora about managing chronic pain. They film me speaking at a conference about student safety and disability accommodations. They film me studying in the library and hanging out with Kate and living my regular college life with Tourette's as just one part of who I am. The filmmaker tells me during a break that my story shows surviving trauma doesn't mean being broken forever. She says I'm proof that being changed by trauma and choosing how to move forward are both possible at the same time. I'm applying to law schools now with a clear focus on education law and disability rights. My personal statement writes itself because I know exactly why this work matters and what I want to accomplish. I write about crawling on a track with a broken ankle and learning that student safety depends on adults willing to prioritize protection over convenience. I write about hiding my Tourette's for 3 years and discovering that accommodation isn't special treatment, it's basic access. I write about the policy changes my advocacy helped create and how I want to spend my career making those changes happen at a systemic level. Every law school essay asks some version of why I want to practice law, and my answer is always the same. I want to be the advocate I needed when I was 17 and hurt and scared. I get acceptance letters from several good law schools, and 3 of them offer significant scholarship money. I'm sitting in my dorm room opening emails when I see one from Arjun with the subject line recommendation. He's attached a copy of the letter he wrote for my applications and tells me I can read it if I want. I open the file and start crying halfway through the first paragraph. He writes that I'm already an advocate, and law school will just give me more tools to do the work I'm clearly meant to do. He describes watching me transform from a traumatized teenager into someone who speaks truth to power and refuses to let institutions hide behind policies and procedures. He says I have the rare combination of personal experience, analytical thinking, and genuine compassion that makes the best civil rights attorneys. I save the letter and read it whenever I doubt myself or wonder if I'm capable of this path. Kate texts me one afternoon that she's engaged and asks if I'll be her maid of honor. Her fiancé is someone she met in her education program, who shares her passion for supporting students with learning differences. I say yes immediately and spend the next 6 months helping plan a wedding while finishing my senior year. The wedding is beautiful and small, and when it's time for my speech, I stand up with my shoulder jerking and my head snapping sideways. I talk about how Kate saved my life by pulling a fire alarm and speaking up when I couldn't speak for myself. I say she showed me what real friendship looks like, and what it means to act when action is required instead of staying silent because it's easier. I tell the story of her crying on the track while Coach Lester yelled, and how she refused to pretend everything was okay just because an authority figure told her to. There's not a dry eye in the room, and Kate hugs me so hard my ribs hurt. I graduate college with honors and a job offer from a nonprofit that works on student safety policy. They want me to start in August, but I've already decided to defer law school for a year to get practical experience. I know my path is clear even if the timing is flexible, and 1 more year of direct advocacy work will make me a better law student when I do start. My parents drive 4 hours to attend my college graduation and sit in the front row taking photos. After the ceremony, Dad pulls me aside and tells me I'm the strongest person he knows. I think about the girl who was afraid he wanted a son instead of a daughter with disabilities and trauma. I think about all the conversations we've had over the past 3 years where we've both admitted our fears and grown beyond them. I tell him I couldn't have survived any of this without him and Mom believing in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. I start my job at the nonprofit in August, and I'm immediately assigned to cases similar to mine. I help students and families navigate reporting abuse and accessing accommodations. I review school policies and identify gaps that allow harm to continue. I train administrators on recognizing and responding to complaints appropriately. Every case reminds me why I survived and what I'm meant to do with the experience I never wanted, but can't change. A mom calls crying because her daughter broke her arm in PE, and the coach told her to stop being dramatic. A student emails because his teacher mocks his stutter in front of the class. A family reaches out because their kid with autism was punished for stimming during a test. I walk them through documentation, reporting procedures, accommodation requests, and Title IX complaints. I connect them with attorneys when needed and advocates who can support them through investigations. I see myself in every frightened student and every frustrated parent, and I use everything I learned from my own case to help them fight for safety and dignity. 2 years later, I'm standing at a podium in front of my old high school's graduating class as the alumni speaker. My shoulder jerks up toward my ear mid-sentence, but I don't pause or apologize. I just keep talking about asking for help and speaking up when something's wrong. I scan the audience and see a kid in a wheelchair in the front row, and another student whose hands are moving in ways that look like stimming. I hope they hear me when I say they're enough exactly as they are. I tell them that hiding takes more energy than being visible, and that accommodations aren't special treatment. After the ceremony, a mom approaches me with tears in her eyes and says her daughter has anxiety, and hearing me speak made her feel less alone. 3 years after crawling on that track with a broken ankle, I'm doing better than I imagined possible back then. I work full-time at the nonprofit helping families fight for student safety. I have friends who get my tics and my pain without me explaining. I manage my chronic ankle pain with physical therapy exercises and ice packs, and knowing my limits. My tics are visible every single day, and I don't try to hide them anymore. I wake up most mornings with a clear sense of why I'm doing this work. Some days are still really hard when my ankle throbs, or my tics exhaust me, or something triggers memories of Coach Lester yelling while I crawled. But I also have good days filled with winning cases for students and building community with other disabled advocates, and knowing my worst experience became fuel for real change. Last month, I helped a girl whose coach made fun of her panic attacks, and she kept her spot on the team with proper accommodations. Yesterday, I trained a group of PE teachers on recognizing abuse, and they actually listened and took notes. I'm not the same person I was before that day on the track, and I'm glad about that. That girl was hiding her disability and terrified of being different, and convinced her worth depended on appearing normal. The woman I've become knows that disability isn't failure. I know that staying silent doesn't keep you safe. I know that speaking up even when you're scared can change everything for yourself and for people who come after you.